So there was a very peculiar discussion floating around that involved CGI. It was first brought into my attention by Kaito, one of my friends over at Analyst. You can be my friend or analyst too. Just follow me there. My YouTube profile has all of my social media links. And the reason I find it peculiar is because there is no reason for this discussion to even happen. In fact, the fact that there is a discussion happening around this topic is a good topic of discussion, and that's exactly what I'm going to do with this video. And just like any useless, shitty discussion, this one starts on Twitter. This is the tweet that I'm talking about. Mob Psycho 100 Anime Season 3 won't have any CGI animation. Bone Studio President Masahiko Minami talks at CRX 2022 that MP100 will be entirely hand-drawn work. So a pretty straightforward tweet, nothing inherently wrong with it, but the comments are fucking stupid. Dircoin says, yeah, I very much doubt that he said that since these are all shots of the Season 3 trailer that all have CGI in them. So this is a person who clearly has no understanding of what CGI is. The examples that he uses here to show that the Season 3 trailer has CGI in them has no CGI in them. It's not CGI, it is compositing. The casual viewer does not really understand what CGI is, and even Moist Critical, someone who appreciates animation, said this in his Moist Meter review of One Punch Man Season 2.
There's also this over-reliance on CGI in Season 2, which wasn't there in the first season. And I don't think CGI in anime is all that bad. I think it can be used really well, such as in Demon Slayer. There's another modern example. But in here, the CGI looks straight out of a PlayStation 1 cutscene. They use CGI to save on cost, and it shows. It actually looks like origami strapped onto some of the characters with a lot of lights put on it. Genos looks fucking awful. Genos looks like an action figure I would have pulled out of a Happy Meal in the late 90s.
And to the millions of his fans who watched that video, they now think One Punch Man Season 2 has bad CGI, when it's really the exact opposite. One Punch Man Season 2 has some really good CGI models, and not only are they good CGI models, they're also animated really well. Example, this scene where the 2D animation is by Aoki, and in the 3D animation of the centipede, you can see that there are smears added. In anime, you don't really see smears for CGI to depict movement. Usually, they just stick to motion blur. But here they're actually using some really good smear frames to show motion with CGI, which is just awesome. He talks about Genos' arms looking bad, and while he's right about Genos' arms looking absolutely fucking disgusting, that is not CGI. Genos' arms have a bad layer of compositing on it. Same with the cockroach monster, also bad compositing. And Season 2 overall has some atrocious compositing, but compositing is different from CGI. I guess when people talk about it in the literal sense, that this is computer-generated imagery, but that is not how the term CGI is used in anime. In anime, when you're talking about CGI, you're exclusively talking about the utilization of 3D models for animation. And with Genos' arms and the examples that this Twitter user has put for Mob Psycho 100, there are no 3D models here. The next tweet might be the stupidest one, and the reason it's so stupid is because this person clearly understands some stuff about the process of animation, but he chooses to put forth probably the worst take ever. Unless they're doing everything on cells, this is a lie. Ah yes, only cell animation is real animation. So when an animator draws on paper using his hand, that is hand-drawn animation. But when an animator draws on a drawing pad or a monitor, again with his hand, that is not hand-drawn animation. In fact, that is CGI. I hope I don't have to explain to you why this is stupid. It'll take too much time because I'll ramble on and on about it. It's like people saying digital art is not real art. Digital artists even make memes about this topic. In both cases, it is a human being using the appendages attached to their torso to make the art. It is still hand-drawn animation. And the next few tweets are the reason I'm making this video in the first place. And they are equally as stupid as the previous tweet. These go already better than Chainsaw Man for me. Chainsaw Mid shaking right now. Oh, did you see what he did there? He took man from Chainsaw Man and he replaced the man with mid. It's very clever wordplay. And again, Chainsaw Man wishes it was Mob. A ton of comments that say the same thing, that Chainsaw Man is inferior to Mob Psycho 100 because Chainsaw Man uses CGI and Mob Psycho 100 doesn't. There are also a bunch of other tweets that say Mob Psycho Season 3 is going to be the best season because this time they're not going to use any CGI. Season 1 and 2 of Mob Psycho 100 don't have any CGI in them either. The character models, the effects animation, and even the background animation is mostly hand-drawn. There's no CGI ever. These people don't even realize that, but they're jumping in joy to the idea that Mob Psycho Season 3 is not going to have CGI. Because if it had CGI, it would of course be inferior, right? It would be like Chainsaw Man. Oh, I'm sorry, it would be like Chainsaw mid. Right now in the anime community, CGI has become synonymous with bad. According to a lot of people, CGI animation is objectively inferior to 2D animation. CGI is a completely different type of art form that is not trying to replace 2D animation. You can't put one over the other because they're simply not the same. The main argument put forth for this is, of course, that this is anime, and anime is defined by 2D animation. And to some extent, I do agree. What makes a show anime is two things: the art style, obviously, and the overall vibe and feel that it gives off. And the second point, the vibe and overall feel, is really important. It is the reason why Dorohedoro feels more anime than Avatar: The Last Airbender, even though Avatar is mostly 2D animation, whereas Dorohedoro is mostly CGI. Artists should have full creative control over their works, and anime is one of those rare mediums where this is the case. And if an artist prefers using CGI and you don't like it, that is entirely fine. But saying that that is objectively bad, that is just not true. And that brings us to the topic of what even is a CGI show. Now I'll show you two sequences and you decide which one is a 3D sequence and which one is a hand-drawn sequence. Now that you've made your decision, I'll actually explain what is happening in these sequences. So animation is broadly divided into three. There is foreground animation, which usually occupies the characters or any model that is in the foreground. Then there's effects animation, which involves animating all forms of effects. It could be animating debris, liquid, smoke, lightning, etc. And last but not the least, there is background animation, which, as the name suggests, is used to animate the backgrounds. Background animation is extremely necessary in action scenes to make the flow of the foreground look more dynamic. Now let's get back to the Demon Slayer sequence again. Here, Gyutaro and Tengen are the foreground characters and they are drawn by hand. The background with all the houses and the ground that they're on is CGI. So the background animation is in CGI. And all of the effects, here the blood blades that are flying towards Tengen, they're also done digitally, it's CGI. So out of the three components of animation, only one is 2D and that's the foreground. Now let's get into the Attack on Titan sequence. Here the Armor Titan and the Attack Titan are the foreground characters and they're animated in CGI. They are 3D models. The background, however, is static. It's just a hand-painted 2D background. And the effects animation, the blood and smoke, is again hand-drawn. It's drawn frame by frame by an animator, probably Satoshi Sakai, who specializes in effects animation. So in this case, only one of the three components of animation is done using CGI, whereas the other two are hand-drawn. It's not easy to classify one anime as 2D anime and another one as CGI anime. It's just that generally people don't give much of a shit about background animation or effects animation if it's done digitally. It's only if the foreground is done using CGI that they lose their minds. And the reason there's such a heavy emphasis on foreground animation comes back to the idea of art style. When you're animating effects, you generally don't need to care much about art style. Many animators animate effects completely differently. Take this scene from Mob Psycho, for example. We have this fire animation first, and it doesn't even look like fire animation. It's just like liquid animation. And when the animator switches, the fire looks completely different now. Similarly with background animation, Keiichiro Watanabe has this rough and smeary form of background animation, which looks nothing like Nobumitsu Suzuki's background animation, which is pretty much photorealistic. Background animation and effects animation are not limited by art style. But when you come to foreground animation, things change. Foreground is usually about characters, and you need to keep character faces consistent. So many different animators work in every single episode. All of these animators have completely different styles, and if they apply their style to that scene, then the characters will look different in every single scene. That is why you have a character designer who makes a character design spreadsheet, and you have to follow those character designs. And there's also an animation director who make corrections to the animator's work to make sure the characters look consistent across the animation styles of all of these different animators. It is completely dependent on art style. Take something like Berserk and Dorohedoro. Those shows are not going to have the characters suddenly turn into chibi figures for the comedic scenes. So you have to follow the very specific character designs and be faithful to the manga. And the manga has extremely detailed character designs that is pretty much impossible to replicate in anime format. So what do you do if you want to have hyper detailed character designs and also want to have them move? you use CGI for the foreground. CGI is used here because of the limitations of 2D animation. In Mob Psycho 100, you don't need to use CGI for foreground animation. Have you seen the character designs? They're very simple, they're very easy to animate. Using CGI would only make the show worse. Whereas in Chainsaw Man, the character designs come under the detailed category, where you don't have much leeway to alter them during scenes. Especially something like the Chainsaw Man itself. Drawing the Chainsaw Man by hand, frame by frame, would be extremely difficult. Using CGI here does not make Chainsaw Man any less impressive than Mob Psycho 100. I would say it's even more impressive than Mob Psycho 100 in this regard, because they are perfectly mixing CGI and 2D here, which is much more difficult than just drawing everything with 2D. The same goes for effects animation and background animation. CGI is just used to cover up for the limitations of 2D animation. Effects animation can be really difficult if there's a lot of it. When a studio like Ufotable uses digital effects, which greatly enhances their scenes, sometimes it detracts from the experience because they go a little bit overboard with it, and other times it just simply doesn't look as good as the 2D animation, like the blood effects. But they can still get away with using it because effects animation, as I said before, is not limited by art style. Unless, of course, the show revolves around the idea of effects animation, like Fire Force. In Fire Force, every scene where specific fire powers are used, the fire animation is always just gorgeous effects animation. And if those effects were replaced using CGI, that would definitely detract from the experience. And in the case of background animation, it's just widely accepted that using CGI is just better, because background animation is an extremely difficult and time-consuming process, and it just requires a crazy level of talent that even if some animators have, they just prefer not using it. For example, Arifu Mima is someone who's definitely capable of extremely high-detailed background animation, as proven by this shot. The way the camera starts from ground level, moves up with fully animated buildings, and then the fully animated backside of the colossal titan is just absolutely incredible. But as we all know, most Arifu Mimai shots in Shingeki no Kyojin has a 3D background, because animating dozens of buildings is simply not feasible. And the main reason, of course, that people can get away with it is because background animation is again not limited by art style. It is somewhat limited by art style if you use hyper detailed backgrounds. If those CGI models were used in Mob Psycho 100 and its cartoonish art style, it would be immediately noticeable. It would be something off. So it is somewhat limited by art style, but the problem can be overcome. It's not like foreground animation. With foreground animation, as long as the CGI is not interfering with the art style, it is fine to use. I'll take an example of this clip by the Anime Man.
Look at this shit. Look at this shit. He's in 3D. He's in 2D. What?
So what he's saying here is not that it's bad that they used 2D and 3D together in one shot. What is actually wrong here is that it is so easy to notice that one character is in 2D and the other one is in CGI. Whereas let's take this scene. There's nothing wrong with this scene. It looks very good, and that is why it's impressive. Because in this scene, one character is in 2D, whereas the other one is CGI. Here, Noi is fully animated in CGI, whereas Young Shin is animated by hand. In fact, even their headwear, over Noi, she has her helmet, which is again CGI, whereas above Shin, there's his mask, which is just a hand-drawn illustration. Attack on Titan final season takes this another step further, where a CGI model and a 2D character makes contact, and you can really feel the impact, even though they exist in different planes of reality. The Armor Titan is 2D and the Attack Titan is 3D. This is just brilliant mixing of two art forms. Of course, CGI is not used in the foreground just to cover up for the limitations of 2D animation. The limitation of CGI in foreground animation, being the art style, can actually be used as a strength. The best example of this done right is in Mushoku Tensei. In Mushoku Tensei, in all of the dream sequences, the man god is animated in CGI, and it looks wrong. It looks extremely unnatural. The CGI and 2D is not mixed very well, and that is the point. It is supposed to look eerie, it's supposed to look unnatural. You also see this a lot in Smiling Friends. Smiling Friends is all about juxtaposition of art styles, but that is for an entirely different video. If you haven't watched Smiling Friends, I highly recommend you do so. It is very short. You can watch it in like less than 2 hours, I think, and it's just probably the most hilarious cartoon ever since Courage the Cowardly Dog. Which is another good example of a show where the unnaturalness of CGI is used to good effect. Last but not the least, we have using CGI without actually showing CGI. In all the other cases, it was substitution. We substituted for effects animation, substituted for foreground animation, substituted for background animation, but CGI can also be used to directly aid 2D animation and make the process easier. Animation process has a lot of steps. You can't just animate the final product immediately. First, you need to make the storyboards, then you need layout animation, then you need to prepare the Genga, and finally, you have the final product. And CGI can be used to aid any one of these steps. For the Godslap animated video, CGI was used to map out the backgrounds in the storyboards. By the final product, there's no CGI for the backgrounds. It is just a beautifully hand-painted background, but the idea of perspective and all of that is just perfectly conveyed because it started off with CGI boards, which make the process of understanding the space much easier. And CGI for layouts is the most common way CGI is used to aid animation. In Ufotable, this is very common. For example, the Karana Kyokai hallway fight scene, the layout here is entirely done with CGI. CGI layouts were also used in Yuri on Ice. All of this again is just using CGI models for reference as the layout. The Genga is again done using hand-drawn animation. It's not rotoscoping. Rotoscoping is different. Using CGI for layouts is different. And now you understand everything about CGI in anime. Hopefully, if you were someone who considered CGI to be the ultimate evil, you changed your mind. It is a very useful tool and it all depends on how you use it. It is also a completely different art form to 2D animation and they can coexist when done right. Saying that one is superior to the other makes no sense. It's like saying Meliodas vs Escanor has no CGI and therefore it is superior to the fights in Arcane which have CGI. Do I sound stupid? That's the point. Just like there's good hand-drawn animation and bad hand-drawn animation, there's good CGI and bad CGI. It all depends upon the animator working on the scene. And if CGI is used in a show, that does not make it worse. And guess what? Mob Psycho 100 is not 100% hand-drawn animation. They use different art forms in it. The entire ending sequence was solo key animated by Mio Sato, and Mio Sato uses paint on glass animation. And that is as difficult as it sounds. You paint on glass first, and then you slowly push the paint in different directions to change the scenes. In other scenes, Mio Sato also uses sand animation. And in opening 2, there's a segment which I don't even know what to call this. The building here is not CGI. It's actually real life photography. They took a real life footage and used compositing techniques on it to fit the art style. So these forms of art, paint on glass animation, sand animation, and well, real life animation, they're not hand-drawn animation. If these didn't exist, would that make Mob Psycho 100 better? No. In fact, it would be a loss to have these beautiful forms of art removed from Mob Psycho 100, and CGI is just another one of these forms of art. And there's nothing wrong with it being used in anime. And that's about it for this video. If you made it into it this far, you might as well leave a like. If there's something about this video that you did not like, leave a dislike and tell me down in the comment section why you disliked it. You can tell me down in the comment section whatever the hell you want. That's what the comment section is for. If you want to see more videos like this, subscribe. And I know, new location, I moved back to my hometown. This time I have a proper room at least. But yeah, that's about it. Thanks for the views.